Hello everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us this morning or afternoon or evening or night, wherever you're joining us from, to talk about the history of childbirth for this event called 500 Years of Childbirth. And do let us know on the chat where you're joining us from, what time it is where you are, and grab yourselves either some tea or coffee if you are like us in autumn weather, or otherwise a very cold drink if you're somewhere nice and tropical. And let's get started. So first of all, I'll just read you a very brief message from the festival organizers, just to let you know more or less what the Being Human Festival is all about. So this event is part of the Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the UK between 11 and 20 November. The Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Events are taking place both in person and online this year, and you can see the full program on the Being Human website at www.beinghumanfestival.org. The festival can be found at Being Human Fest on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and the hashtag is BeingHuman2021. Please help us keep as many festival events as possible free, and to improve the festival in years to come, do take a moment to fill our feedback survey. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and important to us, and I'll link below in the description event. The link will be there for the feedback form. So finally, if you would like to help support the festival by making a donation, please go to www.beinghumanfestival.org/support-us. Thank you. And now let's get started. So this event, just so you know, is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording with everyone who has signed up for it. We decided to do that because people's work schedule and just the fact that many of you are joining us from so many different places, sometimes it was tricky for people to join live. So you will be receiving a recording, and if you want to go back and, so it will be available for 2 weeks. So I'm Julia Martins, by the way. I'm the organizer of this event. I'm a historian. I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London, and I specialize in 16th and 17th century history of medicine and women, so midwifery, all things childbirth, really. And joining me today is Carly Lockerheim, who is a doula, a birth keeper, and she's particularly interested in home births. So the idea for this event came about when I was pregnant. We are both mothers, and Carly was actually my doula for my daughter's birth, so that's how we met and became friends. And so when I was pregnant and reading a lot about childbirth and trying to prepare myself for it, I would talk to people about things that I was considering choices for the birth. And sometimes people would say, oh, that's such a hippie thing or a new age trendy thing you want to do. And that, because I'm a historian and I'm interested in things like that, it struck me as being very not new what I was trying to do for my own birth. And that's how the idea came about, to maybe compare a little bit about childbirth today and in the past, just to see if we can find some continuities as well. I think we're all very quick to see changes and talk about how much things have changed from the past to today, and some things have, and that's brilliant, but others have remained the same or can remain the same. And in the world of birth activism, as many of you know, there are so many good points to be made in terms of human rights and medicine, and all nice arguments to support the fact that we want all people to have the best birth that they possibly can. But we often don't see historical arguments being raised to help in this conversation. So that's why we decided to have this event and have an interdisciplinary conversation, really. So most of the examples we'll have, Carly will be talking about her current work as a doula, so very much 21st century. And I'll be focusing on 16th century England. So some of the examples won't apply to other countries or other periods, but obviously because this is a very short event, we had to narrow it down a bit. So, so to get us started, we'll take a look at this image of a birth room in the 16th century. And you can see this is a woodcut from a book midwifery book printed in Zurich. And this is a very typical scene of an early modern birth. So you can see the woman lying down who just gave birth, and she's being attended by someone, by an older woman, possibly her mother or the midwife or her mother-in-law, someone from her social circle. And you can see many women around. You can see how the baby is being washed and how the crib is ready for the baby afterwards. You can see two women chatting. And this is just to get us started thinking about this very female culture of the birth room in the early modern period. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. So just to get us started, we wanted to think about childbirth going through the senses, both for the past and for the present. So what would you taste, hear, feel, touch during birth? So we'll now take a look at this other image, another midwifery manual from the period. And this is the earliest example that we have. It was a German book called The Rose Garden for pregnant women and for midwives. And so you can see two mothers, one with a swaddled baby and another one with an older child, a toddler, and they're both in this rose garden, and the rose represents all sorts of things: purity, innocence, and femininity. And to get us started with this image, we thought we could focus on the smells. So what would birth be like in terms of smells? So I'll get started, and then Carly will join me soon about the present. So in the 16th century, in the early modern period, we would enter a birth room, and there would be usually a fire burning, and herbs would be used to purify the air, and they would be used as medicines for the women as well. So flowers like lilies, rose, lavender, frankincense, sage, lilies would all be used, and we would get this herbal mix in terms of smells. There would also often be fumigations, so vapors with these perfumed herbs that could be used to treat the woman, to speed the delivery, to make things easier, even vaginal steaming as well. So the woman could, for instance, sit on a birth stool, so that's basically a stool with a hole in the middle, and a bowl could be placed underneath with these herbs, and the vapors would come up and enter the woman's body. And depending on the herb, it was believed that it would encourage the baby to come out, and sometimes you even had to be careful because they were believed to be so powerful that as soon as the baby came away in the placenta, you had to remove these vapors because otherwise the womb might fall off. So which is another subject in itself. But this is, in terms of smells, besides the blood, the amniotic fluid, all childbirth smells, these would be the main smells, I think, in an early modern birth room. So how do you think, Carly, that this relates to the present?
Well, now we tend to use exactly the same herbs, funny enough, and the same flowers. So frankincense is a wonderful herb to use, and we tend to use essential oils. And so we use diffusers in lots of birth rooms. Lots of women love the smell of lavender. It's so relaxing. And rose as well. And clary sage is used to help bring labor on. So it's all so connected, isn't it? It's all exactly the same things that you would find in a garden 500 years ago that you now find in a birth room today. The vaginal steaming is really interesting as well, because when we hear vaginal steaming today, we automatically kind of think, oh, that's very hippie, it's very out there. So to know that 500 years ago they were using vaginal steaming is quite amazing. It's fantastic how that's come across through the years.
Definitely. And in terms of, if we leave the world of smells and think about sight, in the early modern period, the first thing that we have to keep in mind is how dark birth rooms were. So darkness cannot be overstated. It was so important. So the first thing that women would do as soon as there were signs that the delivery was about to happen, that the woman was going into labor, all windows would be shut, curtains would be drawn. If the woman was wealthier, the tapestries would be hung. There would be just this coziness in the room. And it was one of the main roles of the women who were helping the woman in labor to make this room as dark and cozy and warm as possible. So there would always be a fire, even if it's the heat of summer, there would be a fire going on. And the environment would be as dark as possible with few candles, just as little as possible. And for us, sometimes it's hard to imagine because in hospitals today, everything is so brightly lit. But for an early modern midwife, she would be very much used to that, and the nurses and the attending women, that's the environment that they would be expecting, because it was so important to keep out the cold air and the light, because if the woman had shivers or caught a cold or something, she could have flux, and then she would be very much at risk. And in terms of images, because sometimes I know in the present, sometimes women use like inspirational quotes and empowering words and whatnot, but in the early modern period, there would usually be no images. It would maybe potentially flower images, but nothing too figurative, nothing too human. And especially because of the Reformation, so I don't want to dwell too much into this, but sometimes the Virgin Mary was invoked to help and protect women, because she obviously was the most important woman in Christianity to have given birth. And she famously gave birth, according to medieval theologians, without any pain. And so she was very much the patroness of women in labor. But then after the Reformation, when saints were sort of excluded of church life here in the UK, the Virgin Mary was not as prevalent. So there would hardly be any images, sometimes flowers such as lilies to invoke the Virgin Mary, but not too much. And so it would be very cave-like, womb-like. And I wonder, what do you think, Carly, of that today in hospitals and home?
Yeah, so directly correlating with home birth, we do very, very similar. We like to, as birth keepers, we like to remind people to shut your curtains, create this cave-like room that you can just relax and feel safe and comfortable. And I think that's a big part of it being dark, is that it does have a safety feeling with it. Candles, I think any doulas that are watching, if you have a doula bag, then you've got candles or twinkle lights in your bag. So yeah, we like to keep things nice and dark and warm. If anyone has ever been on a maternity ward, you will know how hot they are. So it's really interesting that everything they did back then, we kind of do now, but we have completely different reasons for it. But it's very, very similar. So yeah, being dark and cozy, putting fires on. We often tell people, if you've got a fireplace, put your fire on. Obviously, we do use imagery now, so we use a lot of affirmations and things like that. And people often, we would tell somebody to watch a movie, for example, just to relax. But generally, it's very, very similar.
And in terms of tastes that the woman would have, in terms of food and drink, because I think today there's also a lot of debate about whether the woman should eat, drink, and how much and when and things like that. So in the early modern period, that was very much not debated, because labor could last, like today, several days, and women were believed to really need their strength. So one of the main things that the women, attending women, not the midwife herself, but the women around the one giving birth would be doing, would be giving her something to drink. Not that much water, really, usually wine fortified with herbs and spices to really give her strength, or mead because of the sugar in the honey that would always help as well. And they would be over the fire making broths, soups, something easy to drink, but very filling and nourishing. And that was one of their main roles, not only during birth, but for the month before birth, when the confinement began, birth itself, and then the month following birth, the lying-in period for early modern women, they would be very much taken care of by these attending women. They were actually called gossips. That's where the verb to gossip comes from, because the gossips were the women around, helping and chatting and bonding and developing all these social relationships, really. And so that was their job. And what do you think in terms of food today and drink?
So
birth.
focusing on the home birth, and yeah, that's what we do. So doulas, and those of you who have had your mothers or your mother-in-laws available, aunts, we would come in and we cook soups, and we always recommend highly nutritious foods. Honey is wonderful for birthing women, and dates, things that are really easy to eat, high energy, make you feel good. And it's really important to keep your strength up, especially in long labors. Water, we often use water now rather than wine, unfortunately, I think, for some women. But
what a shame.
water is something that we often have a straw and a cup of water, and we're making sure that the women are drinking and staying hydrated. It's very important to stay hydrated throughout the process, because it can be exhausting. It is labor.
It is.
But it's really interesting. Food is all over. In every culture, food is used throughout birth. So in the prenatal period, through birth, and then postnatally. A lot of England, we've lost a lot of our postnatal traditions, and we're sort of seeing them coming back now. But if we look at the Chinese culture, they use a lot of soups and a lot of red date chicken soups, very high energy, very easy to drink. And it's pretty much exactly the same as what we did 500 years ago.
That's
and now postnatal dealers will come in and they'll cook for you, and we cook soups and all kinds of nutritious stews and things like this. So very similar.
And speaking of all things comforting, I wanted to just touch briefly on the matter of childbirth and pain in the early modern period. So let's look at a slide now with this woodcut of Adam and Eve, and you can see this is a very stylized tree of knowledge with a skeleton as the trunk of the tree. I think this image is rather wonderful, and it's also from a midwifery manual. So just to give you a little bit of context, not to go too much into the Bible, but in Genesis there is a passage that was very, very well known throughout the medieval and early modern period, in which the curse of Eve, as it was called, is described. So to the woman God said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Which, of course, we can debate. Let's not, But I just wanted to touch on this briefly, because obviously women throughout history, in all times and periods, women have had to deal with discomfort during birth. And they have developed multiple techniques and ways to make themselves more comfortable. But what's interesting about the medieval and early modern periods is that the curse of Eve was bestowed on Eve because she ate the fruit, the apple from the forbidden tree, and so she was punished by God because of her curiosity, and that's where the childbirth pain came in. So that's why in the Virgin Mary's case, she did not feel pain in childbirth. She could not have, because she had not sinned, because she was a virgin, right? So it's all lots of theological debates. We don't want to get too much into it. But enough to say that women were completely expecting pain, not just from physiological reasons, but because of religious reasons as well. And that's one of the main motives why, even though there were ways of dealing with this pain and discomfort, or whatever we want to call it, women and midwives had to be careful how they went about it, because you could border on heresy if you found a way or try to find a way of completely getting rid of pain, because it was part of women's lot as daughters of Eve. So most of the early modern medicines and recipes that we have to deal with childbirth pain, they focus on speeding labor, on getting it over with, basically, because then the pain wouldn't last as long. So that was the focus. And I wanted to mention this briefly because for the next sense in the childbirth world, I want to talk a little bit about hearing. And of course, because there were so many women in this birth room, there would be the chatter of the women talking. There might be music. One of them might bring a lute or some sort of instrument to play. But there would also be, and that was probably one of the most frequent things that you could hear in an early modern delivery room, was the sound of prayer. And let's look now at a couple of examples that I have here. This image, wonderful image of the woman as a flower opening up to the viewer, is from Jane Sharp's book. It's the most famous, I think, 17th century English midwifery manual. And just because I think it's a lovely image, really. It doesn't have much to do with the prayers. I just thought it was nice. But yeah. So the first one is in the vernacular. It's in English. And this is something that the woman herself would say. And she would ask God, I beseech thee, therefore, in the dangerous time of my travail, which is labor, grant me speedy delivery and joyful holding of my child. So this, again, the focus on speed. The second example that we have here in Latin would be usually said by the midwife, one of the attending women, possibly, but usually the midwife. And what she would say in English would be, O infant, whether alive, whether dead, come out, for Christ calls you to the light. So it would be invoking the child to come out. And these sounds, the sounds of prayer, would be the main thing that you would hear in an early modern delivery room. You would also get lots of charms, sympathetic magic, lots of folkloric traditions as well. And we don't want to get too much into that because we do have a lot to go through. But I just wanted to mention the prayers because sometimes even the short ones, especially the short ones actually, they would be repeated over and over, sort of like a mantra. And I was wondering in the present if we do something similar, you think, with repetition?
Absolutely. So affirmations is probably one of the most common that everybody uses. And if anybody has practiced hypnobirthing, you will know that there's a lot of repetition in the hypnobirthing scripts, and it's very chatty. We can play it now. We don't have to have people singing or talking. We can have your phones playing through different scripts and playing music. Sometimes I have a drum. Sometimes I do take drumming in. So that
sounds nice.
Yeah, I mean, that may have happened back then as well.
Yeah.
Sort of the beating of the drum. So it's just all so similar, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
We don't tend to pray so much. But I'm sure that there are home births where people do say their prayers.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think a slight difference as well is that we tend to now look for the strength within ourselves rather than outside sources, i.e. God. And so that's a really interesting sort of shift. Now we see ourselves, especially doulas, we often tell the birthing mother how goddess-like they are and how they're bringing that up from within.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we have gone from this paradigm of external help, godly help, to finding our inner goddess, really. I think that's incredible. And just last sense, childbirth sense in the birthing room, just wanted to mention briefly touch and massages and examinations in the early modern period. So with the recipes that I work with for medicines and everything to help with childbirth, really, there are so many lubricant recipes. So these would be used by the midwives to examine the woman. And they would usually be based, they're grease, animal fat, plant oils, or even egg yolks, anything that could help make the examinations more comfortable for the women. And so that's something that the midwife would have in her bag, usually. She would bring from her home, and it would be there readily available for her. So she would be examined by the midwife as many times as they felt was necessary. And also the other women, the women attending the birthing woman, they could use touch to help her. So lots of massages, rubbing her back and her belly as well, also supporting her physically, because we'll talk about positions in a little bit. But one of the ways that you could give birth would be supported by women behind you or holding, all sorts of ways. But so touch was a very important dimension of giving birth in the early modern period. And I wonder about today, because I know lots of doulas and birth keepers are massage therapists as well. And what do you think?
Anybody who's ever had a massage and been pregnant will know that could be very nice at the same time to have a massage while pregnant. As a doula, we use lots of techniques in birth to help the labor progress and to help the mother feel more comfortable. So yes, massaging, pushing, and squeezing on hips is something that hurts our arms after a while, but that pressure is the anti-pressure is really, really helpful. Also, some women just like to be gently touched on their hair or their neck or their back, and it just all helps that relaxation and helps the labor progress. We also will go into sort of birthing stools and positions, but the birthing ball as well. We use a lot of women will help support a woman on a birthing ball, and we use rebozos, which are like long scarves that will that we can use to help put pressure on and to support the mother. So yeah.
So I was just wondering before we focus on childbirth positions, um, uh, do you think, just because of your examples, I wonder if are they usually from hospital births or doula activities or home births?
So
because I
my reference, my reference would be home births. I support home births mostly at the moment, so it's not really in the hospital. It is different, and that's a whole other scenario that we can go into, but time is limited. So
Yes, yeah.
I'm speaking from a home birth perspective, and as a doula perspective as well.
Yes,
That's what I do.
Yes.
So we are a little bit more hands-on. Doulas are very independent, so there's lots of us that do lots of different things. So it's all subjective.
Yes, of
and
course. Yeah.
and it would have been back 500 years ago as well, depending on who
definitely.
was available,
Yeah.
who the midwife was, and things like that. So when I refer to we, I'm talking
Yes.
about doulas per se, and the doulas I
Okay.
work with
Lovely.
in our area.
And speaking of childbirth positions and movement and things like that, in the early modern period, I think it's tricky sometimes because the images that we're presented with of women giving birth in the medieval period and in the early modern period, in TV series and films and books, it's not very representative. It's usually lying down, and just as today, women could give birth in several different positions. And the books that I use for my research about early modern medicine, there were several positions that were mentioned. And again, every midwife would advise differently depending on the woman, her constitution, and the position of the baby, how far along she was in terms of her labor, how tired. But I did want to mention briefly that the position of giving birth on all fours was very much used, and it was suggested usually for bigger women or for when the baby was breech, so when the baby was not coming head down, as a possible position. Another possibility was to give birth using a birthing chair or a birth stool, and I have an image here for us to look of that. So you can see it's basically like a regular stool, but there is a hole in the middle through which the baby can come, basically. You could have a back or not, and if not, the woman might be supported by another one of her gossips, an attending woman. So this position of giving birth sitting down could be used. It depended a little bit on the logistics of having a birth stool like that, and some midwives were known to carry their birth stools around, not necessarily very practical or easy, but it was a possibility that women had. And finally, I wanted to mention briefly just giving birth lying down, because same as today, it was one of the main ways in which babies were born. And because usually, especially for women who were not wealthy, the bed and the sheets were one of the most expensive things that the family had. So you wouldn't want to ruin all your bed sheets and your bed with birth, which as we know can get very messy very quickly. So women were usually advised to have a temporary pallet bed in which they could labor and then give birth. So that's even for queens. They would usually have a pallet, more comfortable of course, but still usually a temporary bed in which they would give birth. And they would have specific sheets for that as well in linen. And they attached a lot of symbolic meaning to that as well, and they could pass it on from generations. You could inherit that from your mothers. And we do have several wills in which women have written, and I leave my sheets, my birthing sheets, to my daughter, etc. So there is this chain of motherhood, sisterhood going on as well. And I was wondering today, Carly, in terms of positions, what do you think the situation's like? Because I also get the feeling from TV series that everyone seems to give birth lying down, and is that true?
No, it's not true. That is depicted in near enough any birth you see in media. That is just not, it's not true. Women are encouraged both at home births and in hospital births to move, to change positionings. Being on all fours is still quite very good for breech, which is a variation of a normal position for babies to be in. Being on all fours can be very helpful. It helps, we're using gravity to help us here. The birthing stool is a great tool, and we are seeing them now being used in hospitals a lot more. We're seeing a lot more hospitals have them available. Not necessarily used very much that I've seen, but we don't tend to have them in home births anymore. But we do use the ball, as was talked about a little bit earlier. The yoga ball is almost like the replacement for the birthing stool. So it's a lot easier, isn't it, to move around than a big wooden stool.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, women still give birth on their backs. That is still commonplace. But I think that doulas like to encourage women to move around and use different positionings, and standing up and using things to brace on is also really good. And it's really about letting the woman find what's comfortable for her.
Yes.
But that's, in the home birth scenario.
And it's the same in the early modern period. You could have something hanging, like fabric, for instance, to hold on to and support yourself. I know that's something that women do today as well. Yep. And just because I mentioned briefly babies being breech and how to manipulate, how to try and change that position using all fours, and because we talked about lubricants and things like that, I just wanted to mention manipulating the fetus in the early modern period. And here I have an image which I find I quite like, of babies in the womb in all sorts of funny positions. And you can see twins, you can see baby just flying around, swimming, dancing, doing headstands and handstands and whatnot. But and this is something that I think it is important to mention, because sometimes people have the impression that midwives in the past, they just didn't have much knowledge, and they had to basically just find out as they went along, and that's very much not true. So Jane Sharp, for instance, the midwife that I mentioned earlier, and she's the one from which this woodcut is taken from. So she had several instructions about the podalic version, which is how to turn the baby around. If the baby is coming feet first, how to turn the baby, how to manipulate it. And that's something else that the midwives could do in the early modern period. They could help the baby. Babies could be born breech, just as today, but they could be manipulated as well. And that's something that for which they used lubricants. So just to keep in mind that they did have quite a lot of knowledge in terms of manipulating the baby to help it come through. And it's something that it's so impressive when we think about them in the dark doing all that. And I read once in one of these midwifery manuals about how the sight of the midwife in the early modern period, it was not so much through her eyes, if that makes sense, but her eyes were her hands. So she knew through her touch, she felt what she needed to do and how to move the baby around. Anyway, leaving now the positions and movement for a bit, we wanted to chat just briefly about the attending people, so the women helping the one giving birth, and the midwife and the nurse and things like that. So here we have another slide with a laboring woman on a birth chair, and you can see she's attended by her midwife. Her midwife is the one kneeling down, sitting down actually, rather. And she has two gossips supporting her behind her. And you can see, I quite like this engraving, it's a woodcut actually, because behind you can see on the desk that there's thread and scissors. And that was something that the scissor could be used for the umbilical cord, even though it was usually tied and it could be cut with ties. But the scissors are there probably, and the thread, to symbolically help the delivery. So that's part of sympathetic magic. And there were so many traditions in the countryside, especially, in which these symbolic elements would be used to just cut through the pain and to just make things easier. So there's all of that represented in this picture. And we wanted to mention briefly the people around the one giving birth, because so often the way that it's represented in TV and historical novels even, we see a surgeon or a physician. And in the early modern period, that was very much not the case usually. Usually there would be a midwife. There might be an apprentice midwife with the main midwife learning, because that's how they trained. They shadowed an older midwife, sometimes for a decade, and that's how they got their training. There might be a nurse. There might be several nurses if it's a wealthy woman, one for the baby and one for the mother, and all these gossips, so family members, relatives, friends, they would all be around her. Physicians, however, were very, very rarely in the birth room. It was very much an all-female world, and men were only called, and even then, usually surgeons, not physicians, not doctors. They would be called if the midwives couldn't do anything anymore. So if there had to be like an emergency surgery, for instance, and that's something that we don't want to get too much into, cesarean sections. But what was called a cesarean section in this period was not what we know today as a cesarean section, but rather it was something that a surgeon would do when the mother was already dead. It was called sectio in mortua, so literally in Latin, a cutting of the dead woman. And they would do that to take the baby out, not so much in the hopes that the baby would would have a life, because that was very unlikely, but in the hopes that the baby might be alive for long enough for the midwife to baptize it. Because childbirth, we have to keep in mind, in the early modern period was a lot about religion, arguably more about religion than it was about medicine. So surgeons might be called in a situation like that, physicians as well, but very rarely. So it was very much a female world. And I wonder today, Carly, because we have birth partners, like we have doulas, birth keepers, we have the partners of the person giving birth, and we have midwives as well, and doctors. And how do you think that compares with the past?
Well, I think the biggest change is, yes, having partners in the birth room. So you wouldn't have had males in 500 years ago, and now we actively encourage partners to come along and support their wives or partners through childbirth. In a home birth setting, yeah, you wouldn't have a surgeon come to the house. We're very lucky now that we have an amazing healthcare system, so that if there is a problem that arises, a woman can be transferred straight into hospital to have that care from a surgeon if needed. Midwives are very well equipped to support women at home. In the UK, you don't have to have a midwife present at all, and I'm sure back 500 years ago, not everybody would have had a midwife present. So you can still, we still have that ability in the UK to have a free birth. But yeah, generally,
so a free birth is a birth where there's
no medically trained people there. So you could have a doula, you could have nobody there if you wanted, just be you and your partner. They have, with the whole COVID scenario, they have become a little bit more prevalent, as has home birth. The rates of home birth have grown as well. But yeah, generally now we have women with us when we're birthing. So doulas will come in, and also you might have your mother or your sister, aunts, and we still have that support network of women that come in, which is really lovely. Surgeons are amazing, and they're there for when things go wrong, and they're great for that. But in the home birth scenario, midwives are fantastic, and they can do everything that's needed.
Definitely, yeah. And I think we shouldn't think that the role of these attending people was over once the baby was born. So in the early modern period, the midwife might come back the following days to check on the woman and the baby, see how they were recovering. And these gossips that were there throughout the confinement and the delivery, and then the lying-in period after that. So the lying-in period was usually from 4 to 6 weeks. It was a period during which the woman would be literally lying down in her bed recovering, and she would be attended by these women, these female friends and relatives. So they would be taking care of her throughout this period. And it was a time of I don't want to say networking, but of sociability, of developing bonds, community bonds. And it was usually ended with churching. So churching would be when the woman would be taken back to church life, into social life by extension. She would be welcomed back into church, because for this period when she would be at home, she would not be attending church. And the importance of these women helping her was so much, because during this period, all the domestic duties that usually the woman would be doing herself would be taken over by these other people, because she wouldn't be able to do all of that. Anyway, now we do want to have plenty of time for a discussion and for questions. And I know that we have only briefly touched a lot of very interesting, to us at least, subjects, because we're so passionate about it. We come at it from different angles, but we're so interested in childbirth. But we do want to give you guys, give everyone the opportunity to chat and ask questions. And I think what we hope that the main takeaway from this is that, of course, there have been major changes and ruptures in the history of medicine, and so much has been achieved that has been wonderful, in terms of, for instance, cesarean, in which the woman is not dead. That's fantastic. That's a great thing that we have now. But we do have to stress the importance, I think, of continuity, and of how so many of these practices from the past can help us inform what we do today, and can inspire us really to fight for a better world of childbirth, in which people have more choice and can do things in the way that makes sense for them. And yes, and I guess that's the main role of history in general, is to help improve the present, isn't it? And if we can do that through an interdisciplinary conversation, including midwives and doulas and doctors and historians and everyone else who's interested in making childbirth better, well, then why not? I think we all want to make it the best, most empowering experience we all can for the people giving birth. And so, just to finish up before we go to the questions, I do want to show you a couple of images, just because I find them so fascinating. So this is another one from a midwifery manual. I love her curls. Her hair is so lovely. And you can see that, again, the body is opening up in layers like a flower, and you can peek on the inside as well. And the final image, so this is a woodcut, and then the next one we have, it's an engraving, metal engraving. And that one is fantastic. You can see how relaxed that woman is after having given birth to triplets, because you can see she has one in her belly, one to her right, one to the left on that cushion on the floor. And I find this image beautiful. You can see one of the babies is born on caul, so inside the amniotic sac. And I find this image to be so lovely. It's the German translation of Louise Bourgeois' midwifery manual. So she was the most famous French midwife. So she was a royal midwife. And I think we just wanted to end on this lovely image. So let's think about questions now. And yeah. And just before we get into questions, actually, sorry, but I do want to mention that you will all receive a follow-up email after this event, and that's to give us feedback about what we can change, improve in the future for things like that. We do want to keep the conversation going, so if you want to follow us on social media, on Twitter, or email us, or get in touch, whichever way you want, that would be lovely. We would so much like to hear from everyone. And we will also send on this email a link for you to sign up if you want to join our mailing list, so you can hear about future events and things that we might do, just so we can keep in touch. Yeah, and so thank you. So now let's start with questions. So the first one is, I love the gossips. Would these ladies have known the lady through her pregnancy? Yes. So these were usually women from the community. So they could be friends, childhood friends, relatives. Usually the mother and mother-in-law would be very much involved, sisters. But all of them, and that's very important, I think I didn't mention this before, but all these women attending the one giving birth, they would be mothers themselves. So no virgins, no unmarried women in the birthing room, because they were very much afraid that that might scare her off. I wonder why, marriage and whatnot. So yes, so they would be experienced women who had given birth themselves and who were already part of the social network of the woman. So so there's another question. Have you spoken with Julia Allison, who wrote Midwifery from the to this? Yes, to the 21st century. Yes, I did speak to her, and I think that's a lovely book. It's midwifery from the Tudors. Sorry, can you go back? So I just want to give you the full title, the right one, but it is by Julia Allison, and it's midwifery from the Tudors to the 21st century. I think that's a lovely, lovely book. It's a great introduction. Next question: does early modern evidence show any awareness of birthing mothers' own expertise? For example, if they had multiple births or if they had been present for other births. So yes, we do have lots of material in diaries and journals and letters of women exchanging this information and using their own information for future births. So for instance, there are letters from women to their midwives saying how they were, for instance, very, very calm about an imminent birth because it was already their like 5th or 6th child, and so they knew what they were doing, and the midwife could basically take her time in coming. We do have lots of materials like that in which women would say, well, for my last birth I used this, and now let's not, or let's change, or use the same. So they very much relied on their experience, and the best way to find this knowledge is through letters and journals. So I'll just do one more, and then Kali will tackle one. So do you have any recommendations for books to read for more information on this topic? I do, and I'll show them to you here because we are in my office. So this one is a lovely introduction. It's called History of Childbirth, and it is by Jacques Gély. And it's a lovely, you can see there's a birth room in the image. It's a lovely early modern scene as well. This is a nice introduction to get started. Another one that I really like is by David Cressey's Birth, Marriage and Death, and it covers basically everything in the life cycle of early modern people. If you're particularly interested in women, I quite like this one. It is a light read. It's not too academic, and it's The Lives of Tudor Women by Elizabeth Norton, and it's a very nice one. Sorry, I'll let Carly do a few. Go ahead.
So birth keepers and doulas are...
Oh, you have to read the question because
is a birth keeper and a doula the same thing? Yes. It differs to different doulas that you may ask the question to be honest. A lot of doulas are coming away from the name doula because of the historical beginnings of the name, which a lot of people believe comes from the Greek for woman slave. And so a lot of doulas are coming away from that and preferring to use the term birth keeper because in essence, we like to keep birth. So we like to, we support birth in all different manners. We, from cesarean sections to free birthing in a field, if that's your thing. So we like to keep birth. We like it to belong to the woman. We like to support the woman throughout birth. So it's interchangeable. Birth keeper, doula. When postnatal doulas prepare food for the mother, do they ever prepare the placenta? Well, now, yes. There are a lot of doulas who are trained in Placenta Remedies. So yeah, that does happen. There's quite a strict deal with that. You can't, if I'm not trained in it, I shouldn't really be preparing somebody's placenta for them. You can do your own, of course, if you wanted. There's lots of evidence for, and there's lots of information saying that it doesn't do much. It's really down to the individual person. But yeah, Placenta Remedies, was that something that they did 500 years ago? They've used placentas?
I've never found that as a remedy. There are so many recipes about how to bring about a retained placenta. And
did they ever eat the placenta? Because now that's very, very commonplace.
I know that's very in. I've never personally found that in any of the sources that I use for my research. Other historians might, not that I'm aware of, but you could do symbolic things with it, which are similar to what some women do today. What I did, for instance, you could bury your placenta with a favorite flower or tree that you felt particularly connected to. And that could be a sort of blessing for the family. And many of these beliefs, they were prevalent, but then with the Reformation, and they were very much frowned upon. And as the centuries went by, they became more considered more superstitious folkloric practices, but
Yeah.
to each their own, I guess.
The placenta is that I could talk about the placenta for a whole hour. It's amazing. But yeah, placenta remedies are great, and if you have the chance to train in that, then you should go for it because it's very interesting. I just want to say about the placenta as well that what we've started to see anecdotally is that women who are having postpartum hemorrhaging, if they pop a little tiny part of the placenta in their mouth, that seems to help stop postpartum hemorrhage very quickly.
That's incredible.
So I have a question here about adding items to birthing bag: twinkle lights, battery candles, laminated affirmation cards, birth positions, massage techniques. Yes, rebozos are fantastic tools to add, but also you don't need any of it because you yourself are you do all the work. So we go in with the knowledge and the assistance to help the birthing woman. Do the bags are great, but sometimes we don't even need them. And it was very interesting what you said about midwives using their hands more than their eyes. I've seen amazing midwives who still do this, who can still palpitate and can help turn babies and do all of this stuff. As doulas, we don't do anything medical, so everything is from a non-medical standpoint, so more practical helping. So yeah. You don't need anything, but if you have it, twinkle lights are lovely, and candles and oils.
I really liked that you had biscuits for me, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not academic or anything, but it can help.
Snacks.
Yeah. But okay, so one more question. This one's for me. How do you think, looking back to history and historical practices, we can apply this knowledge to further develop practices today? How can we articulate relevance? I think that's the best question, honestly. I think that's such an important topic. And there are so many ways in which we can do that. I honestly think that there should be more crossover between history departments and midwifery departments. I really think so. And, medical schools in general, but specifically with midwives. I think so many of the techniques you learn today have a historical background. And I think it would be so enriching to see these examples, these images, read these texts. Many of these are available in English. It's 16th century English, but if you can go to the Globe and see Romeo and Juliet, you can read this text as well. And they can teach you so much about how to help, really. I think just the fact that, for instance, one recipe that I came across at a book that I was laughing to myself when I was giving birth because it was suggested to me that I should do it, is if you want to help speed things along, you can go up and down the stairs. And that's something that I found in the 16th century book. And when I was trying to get it over with, that's something I did as well. And I honestly think that the best way in which history can help with how we give birth today is legitimizing practices. Because many of these things sometimes that doulas or midwives even suggest, sometimes women, people in general, who don't know too much about childbirth and who have a more medicalized view of things will be like, oh, that's so silly. That's like new age, hippie, it's trendy, it doesn't really mean anything, it's coming out of nowhere. And I think what we want to show is that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, really. We're just trying to rescue sort of not lost knowledge in a way. And so I think historical examples can really help legitimize practices that today we know work because of medical studies and evidence-based studies. So I think just adding legitimacy and authority
we understand now why they did those things back then, and throughout this talk we've seen that everything is so similar, or can be so similar in the birth room.
I'm searching for I think this one's for me. I'm searching for the primary source in which is based the history of Dr. Wert from Hamburg, who was burned when was unmasked. Edwin, any idea? Oh, that's not for me. Sorry, that's for Edwin. That's not for me. He's very much the expert on that, not me. So let's get to another one. I think it's just so interesting to see these continuities and all these examples, really. Julia and Kali, which would you prefer, birth at home with a midwife in the past or birth in a hospital with obstetrician today? That's a tough one.
I would go with the midwife in the past.
I'd like to hear more about the retained and placenta. Okay, so that's a tricky one. I don't know. I guess it would depend on so many things, like the position of the baby, even, and your body and your ideological beliefs and things like that. I honestly, I was attended by midwives, and they were so wonderful to me, and so helpful. But I know of people who have had fantastic experiences as well with obstetricians. So I don't want to generalize too much, and I only have my own experience. But I do think that we shouldn't dismiss early modern midwives as just superstitious people who knew nothing. I think they knew quite a lot, really. And like Carly said, many of the things that they did weren't for the right reasons, in the sense that they weren't for the reasons that we know today. So for instance, they didn't have the concept of hormones, and today in the childbirth discussion, hormones are so central, but that concept didn't exist. So medicine was very based in humors and the humoral system of Hippocrates and Galen and all that, and so to do with blood and bile and whatnot. So even though the medical framework was completely different, many of the practices were the same. So I think possibly it wouldn't be that different giving birth today and in the past compared. I mean, there are things, lovely things like gas and air and whatnot, but let's not get too much into it. So sorry, another one, I think that might be our last one, about the placenta. I'd like to hear more about the retained and placental issues in the past. So this is something that I find fascinating, really, because when I started doing my PhD in the working with these medical recipes, I wasn't expecting to find so many recipes about placentas. So I was expecting to find lots of recipes about how to conceive, and especially how to make sure that it would be a boy, because we are in the 16th century, so it was obviously very much
important to have
important to have, yes. But I came across so many recipes about retained placentas, much more than recipes to speed childbirth or deal with pain. And obviously, as we know today, getting rid of the placenta after the birth is essential. It's you have to do it one way or another. But in the early modern period, there weren't as many drugs really to help with that, with a retained placenta. So what they did, and it's something that I find so interesting, is that they would use the same formulas that they would use to provoke abortions, or to bring about retained menstruation, or to induce labor, because all these recipes had in common the fact that they aimed to get the womb to contract and expel whatever was in there. So for instance, if you really wanted to have the baby soon because, I don't know, you wanted to induce labor, you would use something like pennyroyal or raspberry leaf. You would have resources like that would make the baby come out. Some of these ingredients, if you used very early on in the pregnancy, might provoke an abortion or inadvertently a miscarriage or something like that. But for the retained placenta, they were usually very similar formulas with these herbs that would provoke contractions, contractions in the womb to help expel the retained placenta. And that's something that was considered essential. But they were more patient, I think, than we are today. You could wait several days for the placenta to come on its own.
Yeah.
I think we are running out of time. We might have one last one. No? I think let's wait a little bit and see if we have a final one. But
like I said, the placenta is such an amazing.
Yeah. Oh, okay. One last question about mortality, about the maternal mortality, because I think that's such an interesting topic. In all historical novels you read and films, everyone seems to die giving birth. It's just so horrendous. And
this is a big question against people having home birth these days as well. Is that lots of people died throughout history giving birth, so it must be safer to go into hospital.
Exactly. And
is that true?
So it's tricky in the early modern period to know exactly how many women died giving birth, because sources are so complicated, and it does vary wildly depending on the time and the place. So usually, like urban environments like London, dirtier environments, there was higher mortality rate. Whereas on the other hand, countryside parishes didn't have as much as an awful rate of mortality. But even then, it was fewer than 1% of women who died in childbirth. So depending on which source you're using, it can be from 0.5 to 0.8, but usually fewer than 1% of mortality. So it's not that awful as the films make us believe that 1 in every 4 women died doing that. No, definitely not. And just to give you a baseline for the UK today, it's 7 out of 100,000 live births. So, of course, things have improved dramatically in terms of mortality, but we shouldn't assume that everyone was dying giving birth in the 16th century. That's very much not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose we'll just touch on the fact that even today, for Black and brown women, they are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts.
Yes.
So we still have a lot of work to do around all of this.
Definitely. Well, I think, unfortunately, time is up, and because Kali and I like this subject so much, we would continue throughout the day. So, but do get in touch with us through our social media or emails. Do sign up for our mailing list on the follow-up email you receive, because we would love to keep this conversation going. If you have the time to answer our feedback form, it's very, very quick. It's like 30 seconds. And so it's something that would really help us. You can also fill the feedback form on the link below. That's the festival one, and it would really help as well. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your interest and your support. And have a lovely Saturday, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.